Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Therese Meldon. I'm with Kim Woods and Dr. Earl Gray Brooks. Kim and I are We Are America the Beautiful. We are a nonpartisan civic initiative committed to building community, educating the public on relevant, timely matters, and encouraging people to vote. So our topic tonight is mental health and trauma. Dr. Earl Gray Brooks is the Associate Dean of Southern New Hampshire University's online counseling programs. He is a licensed mental health counselor and educator with 20 plus years expertise with those facing depression, PTSD, LGBTQIA development, and HIV management. Dr. Gray Brooks is a nationally recognized expert in EMDR therapy. Please welcome Dr. Earl Gray Brooks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now so we can move into the presentation. All right, so as Therese shared, we're here talking about better understanding and managing of our stress and grief during COVID-19. What we'll cover today is to gain a better understanding of how the brain changes and what the brain does in the face of stress, how it changes in the face of stress. We're going to work on increasing the understanding of our natural grief process and how it's impacted during this current pandemic. And then finally, we're going to look at some practices to help mediate and heal the impact of our long-term stress and grief in day-to-day life. Moving right into the first objective, to understand how the brain works in the face of stress, we're going to start with the brain. So the brain, there's two models of the brain that's typically looked at, the lobe models and the triune brain. The triune brain model breaks the brain into three parts. So you're going to see some technical language in the slides, but I'm going to translate that to make it a little more user-friendly, so it's more easily understood. So the first sort of part of the brain is the neocortex, or what I call the thinking brain. This is the outer part of the brain where our lobes are. And the frontal lobe is really what we'll be talking about today, which is the part right here in your forehead. That's the part of the brain that's responsible for labeling things with language, verbally expressing emotions, most of our sensory inputs, with the exception of the sense of smell, which I'll talk about in a little bit, the way that we analyze information coming in, and our explicit and declarative memory. So the memories that we remember, that we can think about and see in our mind's eye, and then the ones that we can verbalize or tell the story of. So that's what that neocortex works on or manages. The second part is our limbic system, and I call this the feeling brain. The limbic system is really the system that all mammals have. So the thinking brain is the human part of the brain for the most part, and some evolutionary animals like chimpanzees and orangutans have some of that as well. But the limbic system is all mammals. And the limbic system really focuses on survival and attachment. Some other elements of the limbic system, or the feeling brain, is our voluntary reactions. So when we have that response, we may feel something in a situation, but we can choose to respond or not. That's part of the limbic system. Implicit memory. So the memories that are in the mind that kind of guide some of our decisions at times, but we aren't necessarily thinking about them in the moment. And then the chemical level of our emotions. And then the third part of the triune brain model is the R complex. It's also referred to as the reptilian brain. So it's the brain that is really all doing, all actions. Includes our reflexes and involuntary reactions. So when we're compelled to do something. Movement, so our physical movements. Our muscle memory, so like riding a bike, that you've all heard the phrase, it's like riding a bike. If you haven't done it for a long time, you jump on the bike, you remember, because your muscles remember that. Procedural learning, so that step-by-step learning of what the right next step is. Symptoms, so when you think about any concern you might have, a symptom is going to come through that R complex. When we are sweating because we have a fever, for example, that's an R complex. And then it also sort of it manifests any habits or compulsions or addictions that we may have. There's a process component to the R complex, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's the three parts of the brain. There are three buckets, if you will. I, I want to share this because it's important to start thinking about your brain in a thinking brain, a feeling brain, and a doing brain. They work together in concert, but they do manage different pieces. So we're going to talk about how these three parts of the brain work together to process information. So we as humans have information coming in at us at all times. Information comes into our systems through our senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. So sight, sound, taste, and touch, like I mentioned a moment ago, come into our system and go through that cortex so we can process the information in a way that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Smell actually comes in and goes right to the limbic system. It's the most primitive sense. Um, some have described it as the sense that was identified to smell fire when we were cave people or what have you. So that's why it goes right to the limbic system and has an alert to it. So when we think about that information coming into our system and we think about people in general, no two people have the exact same response to that information. You know, I think about the concept of the meal chicken and liver and onions. Some people love chicken, liver, and onions, and some people might hate chicken, liver, and onions. I don't think I've ever met anyone who is sort of moderately like, chicken, liver, and onions is okay. um, and that's because their brains have a reaction to it because of past experience. So that's why information process is the same, but how it manifests in our brain is different. So let's talk about the process. So as I mentioned, information comes into our system. Now we're going to walk through this process as if we're going to a theater event or a sporting event. Okay, so the sensory information comes in. It's us driving into the parking lot or parking our car or coming in public transportation and arriving at the either theater or stadium. When we get to the gate, the first person we meet is the ticket taker. They check to see if our ticket is valid or not. The amygdala is the part of the brain that does that for information. It looks at the information and says, is this information dangerous or not dangerous? We're going to talk about not dangerous first. So in this situation, the ticket taker would say, this isn't dangerous information, so I don't need to make any notes about it. I can just stamp your ticket and move it forward. So when the ticket taker does that, or the amygdala, then we move into the lobby. You know, we go through that ticket gate. We're either in the lobby of the theater or we're in the stadium where there's souvenirs and so forth. And in that lobby, what we do is that information starts to mix with information that we've already had in our experience in the past. So, you know, it's like going into the lobby and seeing an old friend that you haven't seen in a long time. What a coincidence, we're at the same event. We're there for it briefly. From there, since it's not dangerous information, the hippocampus sends it to the usher, our thalamus, and the usher is directing the information. In a different type of analogy, we might call it a traffic cop, saying which information goes where. So since this is not dangerous information, the thalamus will naturally and easily process it up the steps to the seating, which is the anterior cingulate, moving it to what I call the bouncer. You know, the bouncer lets information in or not and tells them where to go. And that's the corpus callosum. And once it comes into the system, the bouncer really says, okay, information, you go to the left part of the brain or the right part of the brain. So if you think about we're in your forehead now. If you think about your forehead, there's the left side and the right side. They're both essentially like director's circle level seats. So, or those perfect stadium seats where you can see everything and there's nothing obstructing your view. It's because this system is really how we determine what we're going to do with non-dangerous information. The left brain is responsible for analyzing information, describing using symbolic language, setting boundaries and limitations, so rules and live in here. The way we individuate ourselves from others, so what makes us unique. It also is concerned with past and future timeframes. So it's constantly comparing information to past and future to see how it can analyze it to determine what to do. Now, in complement, the right side of the brain focuses on our sensory warehouse. So when that sensory information comes in, it's processing it to see what to do with it after it gets to the right brain from those steps that we just talked about. It also labels emotion. So it doesn't necessarily assign the words to the emotion, but it labels it. The right brain is the one that knows what sad feels like. The right brain is the know what happy feels like, for example. And that's how the right and left brain work in collaboration. The right brain also, conversely from the left brain, prevents us from individuating. So when we're at one with something, that phrase that is used in many different ways, when we're at one with nature, for example, that's really tapping into the right side of the front part of our brain. Okay, those director circle seats, again, that perfect view, nothing's obstructed, it's very clear. Um, the right part of the brain is also related to creativity and colors and vivid colors. So if you've ever had an experience in your life where you remember just very vivid, bright colors, it's because your right brain was very active. Could have been a creative activity or something like that. The other complement to the left brain is the right is really focused on the here and now only. It's not assessing past experiences or future experiences. It's saying, what's right now? What's happening right now? And that's how these two communicate to each other, the left and right, to really make sure that things are working effectively. If I were going to put this into, give some labels to these, the left brain would be like the CEO of the stadium or the theater, so the executive officer. The right brain would be the COO, the operations officer of the theater or stadium. So they're both very important and have to work together for success in the theater or stadium. Simultaneously, since the information was not threatening or dangerous, the usher, the thalamus, also sends a message to our internal alarm system. Okay, and this alarm system is still in the limbic system, and this alarm system is to tell us whether we need to prepare for danger or if we're fine. So that usher just says to the alarm, there's no alarm, you don't need to go off, we're fine. From there, the alarm sends a message to our 911 operator, which is our cerebellum, and then down through our midbrain and brainstem into our spinal cord. These are our maps to our body and how we would react or respond. Okay, since this is non-threatening information and we're processing it in a very organized way, there's no need for the 911 operator to do anything. There's no need for the alarm to be sounded. So it just all stays quiet, and we would have whatever natural movements or reactions or responses would be appropriate given the non-threatening information. And that's how we process information generally that is not threatening. Now we're going to talk about what happens when it is threatening. So, same image. Now we're looking at some disorganized information processing. The reason we use the word organized versus disorganized is because the disorganized is a result of the left brain not functioning as effectively during threatening information. And we'll talk about that more here in a moment. So again, information comes into our system through our senses, sight, sound, taste, smell, touch. It enters to the ticket taker, the amygdala. Again, the ticket taker says, is this a valid ticket or an invalid ticket? In this situation, we're going to say this isn't a valid ticket. We think there's something wrong here. So that ticket taker is going to make note of that ticket, or the amygdala is going to make note of this information coming in. So next time, if we have similar information, we don't have to assess it as quickly. It can just go right to it and go right to moving forward. So it keeps a little piece there. Then it moves quickly into the lobby with the hippocampus. Now this time, when it gets into the lobby, the lights go out, things shatter. Because the hippocampus realizes, oh my gosh, this is dangerous information. So similar to the amygdala, the hippocampus has to keep some pieces of this as well. So next time we can move faster to protecting ourselves. What that does is that starts to atrophy or make the hippocampus a little more dense so it doesn't work or process information as well the more threatening experiences we have. Okay. Um, Once it's in there and it's kind of shattered, so it breaks up in the lobby, what is remaining is usher to the usher, if you will, rush to the usher. The usher still has to report this to the CEO and the COO. So it quickly sends the information up the steps to the seats, down to the bouncer. The bouncer rushes them into the director circle. So that way the CEO and COO can look at the information. The challenge in our brains is when the information is threatening and the ticket taker says it's threatening, the lobby is now kind of in disarray, the usher's hurrying things through, the bouncer says it's dangerous, our left brain shuts off. The CEO's like, you know what? COO, you deal with this. Right brain, you deal with this. I'm shutting down. Now, what the reason for this is the left brain, like I said, manages past and future. Present threat it's too difficult for the left brain to do that in that moment. So it shuts off. The energy floods out of that left brain, which moves over to the right brain, which excites the right brain. Now, remember, the right brain doesn't have analysis ability, doesn't know rules or boundaries. It just knows, information is dangerous and how it feels. So the right brain, similar to the amygdala and hippocampus, also makes a note about this information to save it to be able to communicate to the left brain later, okay, when they return. They send it back to the thalamus, and this time the thalamus was panicking because the right brain never sends this type of information back. So when it does, it's dangerous. The usher quickly sends the information to the alarm system, and then the alarm goes off. And so this is when our survival mechanism kicks in. So remember when I mentioned a few moments ago that the limbic system manages attachment and survival, okay? This is our survival mechanism kicking in. It's important to remember that our attachment system is also managed in the same area. So they're related. And that's an important relationship in how we understand the world. I'll talk about that a little bit later too, but I wanted to make sure I put this here so you could see where it fit. So when the alarm sounds, our instincts kick in. This is where our left brain's off. We're not thinking cognitively, we're experiencing. And this is why when people are experiencing a threatening experience or a true trauma, like a life-threatening trauma, they will describe the experiences in slow motion because the time frame is only now. They'll talk about how vivid maybe the smells might have been, or they'll remember the smells, or they'll remember a specific color or shape of the experience. Those are all the pieces of information the brain's trying to grab onto. So if this ever happens again, we can survive again. We can move faster again. We can get to survival more quickly. So when the alarm sounds, our system goes into fight, flight, or freeze to submission. Okay. Most people have heard about fight and flight. Not everyone has heard about freeze to submission. So I'll give an example. So fight is our default. Our default is to fight back to a threat. If we can't fight, then we're going to fight. We're going to run. We're going to try to get out of the threat. If we can't run and we can't fight back, then our system freezes. And what the system does when it freezes, it releases an excessive amount of opioids so we can go numb. So we don't feel in the moment. We'll feel it later. Not that we don't have feelings in the moment, but it's protecting ourselves at the time. And it submits to the threat to stay alive. So an example of this is when a child might be being abused, children often freeze to submission to survive. Okay, because they couldn't fight an adult. They're a child, they can't run if they're in that situation. So the freeze to submission. It's a protective survival mechanism. So one of the pieces sounds off for our response or reaction or reflex, and then it sends the information down to the 911 operator, to the cerebellum, to the midbrain, to the brainstem, to the spinal cord, so we can do whatever that response is supposed to be. Okay. As we're going through this and experiencing this, time sort of stands still. Like I said, people may see this as slow movement or what have you. Once the system is back online, meaning so once the threat is gone, once we've survived the threat, however we survived the threat, what comes back in is a rush of energy into the left brain. What that does is provides a huge amount of clarity to the left brain, but the left brain doesn't have access to all the information. It only has access to what the right brain was able to make note of, which is why often when someone is relaying a traumatic experience, the story may change, it may adjust, it may be altered, because it's only capturing what the right brain was capable of at the time. Once that energy comes back, the system gets back online, it feels shaky. And so now it has to kind of reset. It doesn't know what to do in that moment. So the internal systems that we have is our fueling system or our process system. So when I mentioned those habits and addictions and compulsions earlier, this is what we're talking about here. So to return to sort of level set, we use either our fuel system or our process system. So you'll see I have in parentheses sex there. So this is an important piece specifically related to COVID as well. As a species, we have an instinctual response to procreate in times of global loss or global threat. So it's very likely that we're going to see a huge jump in our world's population in terms of newborns once COVID sort of relieves. That is instinctual. Again, it's a survival response. Our species needs to survive. So the system who's able to kick in will kick in and do that. So if it's an individual threat, if you will, the fuel system could kick in. And the fuel system is simply anything we put in our body. Food, drink, medications, what have you. Whatever we ingest is related to the fuel system. Process is what we do in a repetitive or routine kind of way. So our process system, sex could be one of those. Shopping, for example, could be a process way to sort of reset. Exercise, anything that we do kind of on a regular basis as a routine could be part of this process. It only becomes problematic if it gets out of alignment, meaning it becomes interfering with the way that we can function in our life. So having routines, doing the same thing regularly, those aren't problems. They only become problems when they interfere with your ability to live that organized style of life. So these are the ways that we develop habits and addictions out of a threatening situation, which is really relevant to COVID-19 and what we're dealing with now. We've seen a huge increase in addiction issues because everyone is isolated, they're alone, there's so much loss, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so what do we have to turn to? Fueling system and process system. We've lost so many of our opportunities for our process system. So what's left? Fuel. That's why many people are eating more, many people are drinking more, or moving farther past that and moving into, whatever other types of addictions or compulsions they might have. I prefer the word compulsion because that really speaks to what's happening. Our systems are motivating us to do something to soothe from the threat. And that's what these systems really are trying to do. They're trying to soothe the system to be able to really get back to what was in balance. This last, the types of threat, it's important to call these out because many people assume that a trauma has to be a car accident or some life-threatening event. And the truth is, those are traumas, and we call those either capital D disturbances or capital T traumas. Okay, they're big. Everyone would agree that was traumatic. Then there's the lowercase D disturbance or lowercase T trauma. That's those emotional experiences that are threatening us. So for many people, if they had to no longer go to their job and were able to work from home, that could have been an emotional threat. Thinking specifically about an extrovert, someone who needs to be around people all of the time, because that fuels their system and fuels their spirit. Having to work from home in a more isolated way could be a threatening event for that person. Okay. So the there's a lot of subjectivity of how capital or lowercase are defined. It's really individual for that person. Um, but all of these elements is what impacts our ability to then function after the threat is over. And that's another really important part. The threat is not over for COVID right now, 19 right now. We're living in this process sometimes on a daily basis, might be weekly, might be monthly. You know, personally, when I look at the news and see the numbers rising and rising and rising, you know, that's impacting me in a threatening way. It is increasing my worry about those I care about. It's normal, you know. But if we don't know that's what's happening, it's going to feel very different. It's going to scare us even more. And then that's when we start going into our mind and making up stories about why we're feeling this way, when in truth, we're reacting normally to abnormal circumstances. So I put this slide in here just as something to see. This is an actual image of memory being created. So the first slide, which it's very hard to see, but there's a little bit of a line kind of right here. It's really hard to see. But over here, these yellow dots, if you can see the little green dots here next to the yellow arrows, for example, that's what happened after the threatening experience that was done to this brain. So this is before the threat, this is after the threat, immediately after. So this is what memory looks like in the brain. And that's why I share it, because we've all seen pictures of the brain with all these different wires and lighting up and that forth. These little dots are those pieces of information that we talked about a moment ago in the amygdala and the hippocampus and all through the brain. You know, the usher is seeing all these dots and they are connected by a wire of protein throughout the brain. So the reason this is important is, let's say, for example, we're a person who experienced a health threat many, many years ago before COVID-19 happened. We have memory networks already for a health threat now, if we're that person. So this new health threat is going to exacerbate the past experience and make the current experience feel more impactful. And that's the importance of memory networks, because the more similar experiences we have, the more ingrained those networks become. So think about like a groove on a piece of wood. If you take something metal or a pencil and just keep rubbing and rubbing and rubbing, it's going to create a groove in the wood and it'll get deeper and deeper and deeper. It's the same thing with memory and experience. The more times we have similar experiences, the more ingrained those become in our memory. So I'm going to pause here for some questions because we're going to shift and move into our next objective. So let me pause here. I'm going to stop sharing so we can have our pictures back. And what questions might I be able to answer?
Well, all of this is fascinating. So I love how you took very complex information and simplified it for those of us who do not have degrees in anything remotely medical or psychological. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
So I love what you talked about with the left and the right brain and how the left completely closes down, because that describes so much, the, like, you know, not being able to recall, not being able to remember, not having any ability to really assess. So the way you explained it, and I know we spoke of the fact that, you know, COVID is this long drawn out experience, right? So with this, you know, you were talking about, okay, the usher takes it, the director circle, you know, all the things. What happens? Is this happen repeatedly? I mean, is this what's happening repeatedly to us day in, day out?
The processes I just described are what happen in split seconds.
Okay.
And so it happens every time we get sensory information, which is all the time, all day.
Right.
So if we're having similar or matching, it's going to be either organized or disorganized, for example. It's going to jump into what we know. So yes, it is constantly and consistently happening based on the stimuli that's coming in.
Right. Okay. So question about the stimuli. So if we were to, we're all in this scenario, right? We're in this together, right? So we're in it, you know, here we are.
Right.
So if we were to, this is why a lot of people are saying, you know, I'm not reading the news, I'm not keeping in touch, because they don't want that input. And yay, whatever decision people make, I'm all for it, right? And I think we can all say that. However, is it beneficial to get information in a much more subdued way, in a much quieter way versus, oh no, there's the red flashing screen, there's the, drama of whatever, maybe a newscaster, I don't mean to diss the media, but, maybe a newscaster wants to get ratings. And so they're making it this overly dramatic versus someone else who may be just reporting it in a very objective, just a very methodical and, peaceful way, I guess is the word I want to use. Would that change? Could that change the same information and how it's received by the brain?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So it's not the content, it's the presentation of.
Got it.
So,
Okay.
so just an example, that chicken and liver and onions I was talking about,
Mm-hmm.
if I put it on a garbage can lid or on a nice porcelain plate, it's the same chicken liver and onions, but I don't know many people who would eat it off the garbage can lid.
Right.
Even if you don't like it, you might try it off of the porcelain plate.
Right.
It's about the presentation.
Right. Yeah. With the candles lit and with all the
Right.
flowers in front of you and beautiful
Yes.
things. You're right.
Right.
Makes it much more appetizing than, there's
Yes.
Oscar the Grouch with his garbage can, like holding it up.
Right.
Try
Exactly.
this.
Yes.
Okay. So are you finding that people are able to build up, and I don't want to use the word resistance, but I think I do want to use that. So say for example, we're in month 7 or 8 here, right? And so maybe we've been consuming our news and our information one way. So we already have those memory grooves, but now we're choosing another way to have our information receipt.
Mhm.
What impact would that have? So say for example, I know I can common sense say, if I were choosing to get in a very mild form and, and read it and just, kind of mull it over and maybe talk
Mhm.
to some professionals and just really kind of process it as we go. And
Mhm.
maybe I've been able to isolate and I don't have any sort of extreme risk, right?
Mhm.
Just,
Mhm.
and then all of a sudden I decided, well, you know what? I'm going to watch some overfabricated news event and just kind of do that. Would I be more resistant or less resistant versus if I did it the other way?
So when you say resistant, you mean to reacting in a more threatening kind of way?
Yeah, like actually being able to respond versus react.
Yes. So the short answer is it depends.
Okay,
It depends on how many experiences of that alarm we've had in the past.
got it.
If we have those ingrained grooves of a lot of alarm, even if we take the time to kind of heal and it's after, that would be different. But
Okay.
during, it's very difficult. So you're using the word resistance. I might use the word tolerance.
Oh, I like that better.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So there's a concept about there's a window of tolerance we all have, and that's about how much stressful information we can manage, and so that varies depending on the person and their experience. So we can adjust or grow our window of tolerance, and it can shrink. So the more threatening we get, the less tolerant we have. The more soothing we have, if you will, the more tolerant we can get. So it's really about that balance. So if a person has really spent a lot of energy and a lot of time trying to rebalance and soothe and those types of things, then they may respond differently in a more neutral way to a one-time event. But if we have someone who's kind of in that process and still working through it and then is exposed to something a little more threatening, it could just jump right back. It doesn't negate the work that's been done, but it can confuse or prolong the work being done.
Okay, so then I have another question.
Sure.
That is not COVID related, but yes. Okay, so we have had here in this country, let's just stay domestic for,
Sure.
Let's just stay domestic.
Sure.
So we've had, dare I say, threatening information, whether you're on the right or on the left. There's been threats that have been thrown out into the ether here that we've been digesting, however we've been digesting them. Has that made us less tolerant to overlaying COVID on top of it?
It has. The divisiveness in at least the US is threatening to everybody, regardless of views.
Yes, 100%. Yep.
How we react is going to be different because of our experiences, but because of the amount of time that we've been exposed to this ongoing threatening discord, if you will, that is going to make our tolerance less when at the start of this pandemic.
Okay.
And it's going to make it more difficult to adjust. Now, depending on whatever views one has, the most recent event when it came to any type of election could either move you farther to
Right.
less tolerance or
Absolutely.
soothe you in one way.
Right.
Either way, you're still impacted by it, good or
Right.
bad.
Right. Exactly.
Mhm.
One more question.
Yeah.
So we know that our ability to digest information has been escalating at a rapid rate due to technological advances, right? So how much of that do we feel has impacted our ability to even have a moment to process?
Yeah, that really comes down to choices. I mean,
Right.
if a person is really being exposed at the frequency that one could be, that isn't going to be a positive impact regardless of
Right.
the circumstance. The more exposure we have to threatening, dangerous, disturbing information, the the more neutral we become to it, if you will.
Yeah.
Which then falls into a bigger problem because we're tipping the scale to being in survival mode more than not.
Right.
And that's where the biggest issue comes in. That's when we see extreme behaviors, if you will, whether it be in a fight way, in a flight way, or in a freeze way.
Right. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Can I ask one more question about the grooves, the memory?
Sure, sure.
So because we may not know, right? Like we may, because the left brain is shut down anytime we have a threat, we may not recall, correct? So we may have had a health threat in our past that we don't even recognize as a health threat.
Hmm.
So how do we then go and process that? Would that be any different process to unwind it, or would it be the same process to unwind it? It just may be more bundled.
So it actually, it would need to be a more structured or more intentional process.
Okay.
So if there's a health experience that we had, let's say in early childhood, before we could even remember anything,
Yep.
it may have been dormant. We may not have thought it impacted us, but now COVID is bringing that up. Is wait a minute, this feels different. This feels really bad, and my peers or the people I'm around aren't feeling similarly. What's going on? That's when it's important to reach out for some professional help to
Okay.
talk about that,
Right.
um, because you don't know what you don't know, and memories are in there, whether they're that explicit memory or that implicit memory. It's the implicit memories that we're really talking about in this question.
Right.
And the only way we will know is when they come to the surface. And the only reason they would need to come to the surface is if we're hitting on that memory network and lighting the whole thing up.
Right. Right. But we don't gain clarity. So the
No,
clarity is not there, just the
no,
feeling is there.
correct. The
Okay.
clarity comes from working with it externally
Right.
and keeping that left brain online while working on it. So that's the other
Got it.
piece, which we'll talk about how to activate the left brain more.
Okay.
But that's the piece is ideally the way to soothe is to keep the left brain online while we're still processing the traumatic information.
Right.
Okay, which is you can't do in the moment, but you can do if you're consciously working really with another person. Whether it be a traditional therapist or a coach or even a friend or a peer.
Right.
Just in a way to start talking through some of these things.
Okay.
And knowing yourself, knowing when you're getting to a point where it feels a little bit dangerous. Many people don't feel comfortable going to a therapist,
Hmm.
which is okay. So talk to your medical doctor. Start
Right.
there. You
Right.
know, everyone has to go to a medical doctor, and most medical doctors now are providing tele appointments,
Absolutely.
so you don't have to go anywhere to do that. So
Right.
that's really the key to that is that left brain staying online while managing that information.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
One more. We just keep talking, so
Hey,
I have
sure.
these questions, right? So here's the thing that I think we all do a disservice of is that if say I was feeling different, more extreme than my peers, I think I would immediately go to, and I think a lot of people immediately go to, then what's wrong with me? And then therefore you might go into like shame. I don't want to tell anybody. I don't want anybody to know because I am not feeling the same way as you are. So do you have any advice? I know we're going to go through like support and things like that. I would love to touch on that particular point then, if it's not appropriate to do it now.
We can touch a little bit on it now, but if someone is feeling that way, the good news is the fact that you have that awareness knows that it's not something wrong with you as a person.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you don't have that awareness, then that's where it can be concerning.
Okay.
So if you are thinking that, it's important to find someone you trust, because the truth of the matter is, you're all humans, regardless of the circumstances, in times of threat or stress, is responding normally to abnormal circumstances.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what I would encourage someone to remind themselves of when they're having
Mhm.
that question: is it me? Am I crazy? Or am I feeling this way? Am I about, no, you are having a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances. So it's the circumstances that are the issue, not the
Yeah.
person.
I love that. I mean, I'm gonna when we post this, I'm definitely going to have that as a because I think it's
Right.
really important to highlight.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree. It is the piece of information that can help someone be courageous
Exactly.
and talk to that one person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, Teresa, I sucked up all the airtime. Are you good? She's muted. Let me unmute her.
There.
Yeah, there we go.
The hippocampus, when
Mhm,
I think you said it'll atrophy. So if
mhm.
it weakens, um, is there a way to strengthen it, to bring it back, or is it always going to be a little bit weaker?
So there's no hard data to answer that question. I can speak from my clinical experience, is that people can heal and develop and grow and be able to process information in a more organized way, regardless of the amount of atrophy or callus or hardening, if you will, of their hippocampus. The amount in which you can grow is going to be unique. So when I think about this specific question, I think about those of our service individuals who fight for our country. You know, many of them are face truly life and death threat on a daily basis. It can occur that some of those hippocampi get hardened, but not every service member has issues. Not every service member who is in combat has issues. So some can heal through the process, but the amount of healing is going to be unique. But healing can happen. That's the most important thing to know, is that it can heal. How far it can heal will depend on many different factors for that individual.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, let me go back to sharing my screen. All right. So now we're going to move into our second objective, is why the brain changes in stress. So why it changes is really based on a few different patterns of development. Our unconscious decisions about ourselves that linger, our procedural learning, so the things we learn over time in an order, our experimental reinforcements. So what this means is, let's say I learn that, let's say I fail a test, for example. I fail a test. And so I'm gonna see if this has to be reinforced. So my next test, I'm gonna try a little harder. If I fail again, then I'm gonna start believing that I'm gonna fail tests. So that's that experiential reinforcement or experimental reinforcement. Either is synonymous. Um, Disorganized information processing also will affect our processing patterns. Organized is kind of the default. We're built to be organized in our processing. Life happens, things change. Genetics play a part, so we can't negate that there is a genetic component to our processing for individuals, depending on our DNA and our family backgrounds and so forth. So that all plays a part too. But these are the four elements that kind of cycle through once have learned about ourselves or decided about ourselves, that either perpetuate our decisions or our patterns or negate them. An important concept in this is, after we're out of a threat, and over periods of time, we start to make decisions about ourselves as people. So going back to your question, Kim, about um, uh, those decisions around someone being able to tolerate or move out of something, is really related to how some of these themes have manifested in their life throughout their life. So there are four what I call both sides have a balance, but there's adaptive and maladaptive. But the first four here really result out of problematic experiences. So when we first experience something that has us question ourselves, we ask, who's responsible? Am I responsible or am I innocent? So it's always kind of self-reflective in that situation. Now, as I say this, this isn't consciously happening most of the time. This is in that implicit limbic system. Um, and if I determine, or it's determined that I'm the one responsible, then I can easily make a decision that I've done bad or I'm doing bad things. Okay, which is a comment on myself as a person if I make that decision. If we continue to have some challenges or regular stressors, then we can move into questioning safety. Am I being threatened? Am I in danger? And this is when we're looking at the external forces that could be threatening us. So safety is external forces coming at us. So responsibility and safety right now are really concepts that are living alive and well with COVID-19, probably on a daily basis for most people. You know, did I do that right? Did I have my mask on correctly? Did I wear gloves? Did I not wear gloves? I mean, all of those types of bargaining questions that we'll talk about in the grief process in a minute. And then safety, you know, what is a threat? You know, it's an invisible, COVID-19 is an invisible threat. You know, you don't know until you know. Power, if stress continues, then we move into this power concept of where I'm questioning it, am I powerless, which is an internal locus of control. Am I helpless? Am I unable to to have a secure life? So if we think about the concepts of safety and security, safety is how the outside world's going to impact us. Security is how the inside world is going to impact us. And that's kind of where our power comes in. And so, you know, if we have ongoing stress over a period of time, we start with responsibility, thinking, am I doing something wrong or bad? If it continues the stress and moves into safety, then I'm questioning, okay, now I may be doing bad things, and now am I unsafe as well because of others? If it continues, then we go into, okay, so if I'm doing bad things and I'm unsafe, I mustn't be able to control myself. I mustn't have control. And so that's where we move into that powerlessness. If that goes on over time, that's when we move into our values of self. And, you know, simply put, it's I'm good or bad. And the maladaptive part is I'm bad, you know. And this is where I'm bad, I'm worthless, I'm stupid, I'm incompetent, I'm valueless. That's where that lives. Okay, that's the deepest level. So it has to be over a period of a decent amount of time for it to get to that level. Responsibility is that first phase, and it's easier to come in and out of. If we can identify something that is responsible and it's not us, it's easy to resolve. Okay, but if these patterns happen over time, that's when it starts inundating itself. Choices, the beautiful thing about choices, it's the antidote. It's how we resolve a lot of these decisions that we make about ourselves by recognizing that, yes, for example, I'll say, you know, I am threatened. Let's say that is a decision that's been made. I am threatened. If we stick with only that option, we're going to stay in that maladaptive cycle. And that's in part how our window of tolerance might decrease. If we're able to say, I am threatened, and say, what other options could there be right now in this circumstance? I'm threatened. I'm actually able to protect myself in these situations. I can fight back in these situations. I can do this. I can do that. I can think this. I can think that. If we can give ourselves more choices, it starts to neutralize these decisions because we're relearning that that is one option, but we have others. Okay. So when we move this into more of a bit of a model, remember I talked about the limbic system, and that's where most of this lives, is the limbic system manages survival and attachment. So they work in tandem with each other. So attachment is that connection with others, you know, whether it be another person, a pet, or, you know, things. That's how we attach. And then survival that we've talked about already. You know, if we have a threatening experience, we're going to look at both concepts and see, am I responsible in my survival mechanism, or or am I responsible in my attachment? So this is where our relationships are starting to be impacted by COVID. Some in a positive way and some in a negative way. You know, if I'm a person who is starting to think I'm responsible for things, I might start pulling away from my attachments because I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to harm them. I don't want to upset them, for example. Um, Similarly with safety, I might start to feel unsafe with people, today what is starting to happen more and more is we're not going out around people. So we're starting to feel less safe when we are around people, even if it's people we love, even if it's people we know in our entire lives. That's a piece that's really impacting us now, because it's an invisible threat. Um, Powerless again, attachment and survival. We talked about survival. In attachment, this is where we either try to take control if it's maladaptive, or we give up control to someone else. That's how it kind of manifests in a relationship, which is unfortunately a concoction that can create an abusive relationship. Not an intentionally abusive relationship, but the experience, the lowercase, you know. And then finally, our value, if we're feeling less valued, we may be putting more expectations on the people we care about to help us feel valued. And that's not fair, or if we're let's say a group of family members and we're all feeling less valued and hoping that each other will help us pull out of that, and we're not happening, that could sort of, back to that experiential reinforcement or experimental reinforcement, that might reinforce that I'm valueless, because we're not recognizing the context of the present. And that's where that left brain is so important. This is all happening without the left brain paying attention to it. If we can become aware of it, awareness is what starts us to be able to shift it to the left brain. Knowing what's going on inside of ourselves can help us become aware. And oftentimes, assuming that there's no other major concern or issues outside of what's happening in the present, that we can resolve it internally or with our peers or people that we care about. Like you had mentioned earlier, if someone's really concerned about that idea of it's only me or it's me, that's where we might want to say, okay, there might be something that could be helpful for you to get some assistance with outside of people you know. Choices down here again is how we resolve this. We recognize the choices. So in that example of, I'm feeling valueless, I want others to help me feel more valuable, and they're not doing it. Well, if I stick with only that, I'm going to feel bad. But if I say, okay, that's one option, what else could I do? Okay, we have more choices. This is in part a motivator for why the pet industry is starting to boom, because pets give us value. Pets make us feel loved. So and we're stuck at home, especially those people who don't live with anybody. That's very isolating. And we as humans are pack animals. We're not intended to be isolated or individual. We are intended to be with. So that's an important piece. When we're able to become aware of our own processes in these or experiences in these or how we're manifesting them for ourselves, we're able to gain a better sense of an understanding of how we interact with the world and how we interact with others, and can lead to understanding better how others interact with us. This can help support much more empathy for each other. And that's really a skill set that takes time and requires us to be aware of us first, ourselves first. That's how we can then provide the empathy. So I'm going to pause here again for some questions to see what we have. So let me stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah, I think from a relationship perspective, it's so interesting in that, I talk to people and I say, yes, but let's look on any silver lining. Like, let's just try to see any silver lining. And life was too fast before, right? And we were always, scrambling to meet schedules and running for the train and, trying to get to the office. And we had 100 meetings in the office, so silver lining, right? Like, quote unquote, silver lining. But I have to tell you, on month whatever X we're on, right? It's too much, right? So I think maybe if there was any loft in this where people could have seen that, we're far past that, right? Like we're way far past that. So from a relationship perspective, I really feel that it's impacting all over the place. Friends you're not seeing, family members that may be extended that you're not gathering with. Definitely the senior community, right? Absolutely devastating. Emergency responders, anybody on the front lines, devastating. For those people that are in quote unquote the norm, if you will, do we have any kind of trends and just common sense trends, as we're talking here to say there's stress at the, I don't know, there isn't really like younger kids versus teens versus adults or male versus female. Is there anything that we can talk about like that? I'm trying to gain awareness and
Yep.
understand.
Yeah. So when it comes to younger children, when the pandemic started, it was very scary for younger children.
Mm-hmm.
For a big transition, depending on age, school age is young school age is what I'm talking about,
Yeah.
and that was a normal experience. That still lives, and what's important to remember is that's part of their development as a human.
Mm-hmm.
That's the trend. We're not seeing that piece now, but we
Right.
will.
Yeah.
That is going to influence how those our children and even those who are adolescents live life. The rest, it's this is why there's going to be a new normal. It's not going to be after COVID. It's
Right.
going to be years from now when those who live through this have changed. I mean, if we go back to the measles, life changed after there was a vaccine.
Right.
When we go back to, the flu, influenza in the 1900s, life changed after that. So, and it changed because of the generations knew something different, lived a different way. So that
Right.
is going to have an impact. Obviously, our senior population, our more mature population, they're struggling so much right now. Um, uh, Isolation is probably the biggest challenge, which increases depression. As we all age, it's natural for us to have some challenges with anxiety and depression. That's normal. That's normal, appropriate aging.
Yeah.
Add a pandemic to it, and that could take it to a more extreme level.
Right.
So really caring for or communicating or engaging with any more mature individual that you're in contact with or have a relationship with is really important, because it's crumbs at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, in terms of kind of an adult population, the real key is the people who are honestly communicating are more protected than those who may be pr- protecting self than sharing.
Right. Right. So people that might be saying, I'm fine, everything's great. Okay.
Right.
So
Yeah,
they're
I'm
just
okay with
denying.
this.
Yeah.
And it could be denial, or it could be that limbic implicit memory trying to protect them from thinking about it.
Oh, got it. Okay.
So that's another piece. Why they're doing it, only they would really know. But that is an important piece. That is not going to help them manage their tolerance at this point. The more we pull away, the less it's going to get, because the less stimuli we can manage as the tolerance decreases.
Okay.
Does that help answer your question?
It does. No,
Okay.
it definitely does. I mean, because we all have people that we know, right?
Right.
Whether they're family, close family, extended family, friends, siblings, children, grandparents, wherever we are, wherever we're living. And I just, we can see I think we can see the youngest and the eldest as with anything that happens, they're the most impacted, right? But
Mhm.
it's that middle place, it's the I don't know, I'm going to make it up, the 18 to 45-year-olds or
Mhm.
something, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and I can imagine, depending upon circumstances, that's going to be different, of course.
Right.
But yeah, I think we've been conditioned to be fine.
Yes.
Certain
Yeah.
generations more so than others, right? So,
Agreed.
and I think especially with this older generation, I'm fine. I
Hmm.
think that was just the way it is. I'm
Yeah.
fine. It's
Yeah.
totally great. Lived
Right.
through depression, lived through world wars. I'm fine. This is great.
Right.
No big
Exactly.
deal.
And that when someone responds to how are you doing, I'm fine, to me that's a dirty word. you
Yeah.
know that's not answering the question. Good or bad would answer the question.
Yeah.
Okay kind of answers the question. You get a sense.
Right.
Fine could be good or bad.
Right.
And
Right.
so that's a piece where if you know someone who is saying that they're fine, ask a little more.
Right.
Tell me how your day's been. Ask those types of questions instead of those short, closed questions. I think about some of the things that we need to do when we're interacting with others now is kind of change the way we're interacting with them.
Mhm.
Instead of saying, how are you today? It's kind of a rote, I'm good, I'm bad, what have you. It's a short answer. Instead of saying something like, so how's your day been? They might give a one-word answer, but it opens it up for more.
Right.
You know, what did you do last night? Or what are you going to do today? Or what's the fun thing you're going to do today? Or what are you going to do to take care of yourself? Those types of questions, that a person might not have an answer, but by asking it or posing it, it forces that person to think about it.
Right.
And that is a way that we can help each other without even doing anything other than talking.
Right, exactly, right. So I'm hearing more specific questions that are maybe more probative and or open-ended questions.
Right.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Sure. Therese, did you have any questions? Okay. Let me share my screen again. All right. So now we're gonna sort of shift out of the brain a little bit and move into the grief process. So the grief process it's an equalizer. Everyone has the same one. And even it moves into some other mammals too, but we're not going to go into that part of the discussion. So, there are 5 stages, phases, cycles. They're conceptualized in different ways by different people. But they are essentially denial, and you'll see I'm going to talk about shock too. So shock and denial, then there's anger, bargaining, and depression, and then there's acceptance. And those 5 concepts, I mean, they're not difficult concepts to grasp. Most of us know what those concepts are, but what makes it the grief a process is how they work together and how they interact. So when we move into our grief cycle, the first phase of grief is shock and or denial. So shock is that I can't believe this is happening, or I don't believe this is happening, where people just go about as if it didn't or isn't happening. So I think about some people who aren't protecting themselves in today's world. You know, that could be part of shock. It may not be, but it could be. Um, Denial is sort of the other side of that same coin. It's just saying, no, it's not real. No, it's not happening. These are normal reactions to loss. And so that's an important concept when we talk about grief. Grief is not about death. Grief is about loss. Most commonly, people understand it as death, but grief is about losing anything. And we have all lost a lot this year during COVID. So all of us have a grief cycle going. How we manage that is different. How extreme or mild it is different. But every single person on the earth is experiencing some level of grief because we've all lost things. That's a really important concept to think about, because if you think about what we do when someone's grieving, like a death, think about how we care for them. Think about what we do. Now think about every single person in the world going through that on some level. I know not everybody is able to do what we would need to do in a grief situation, but that's ultimately what is needed, So that's another kind of opportunity for us to think about as we talk through this a little more is, what might I do if someone had lost, let's say, a loved one or a pet, for example, you know, um, that those activities, those thoughtful things that we might do, we could do for anybody right now, and it would be value added, you know. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but not to mention the actual death losses from the pandemic. So those who are experiencing that's starting to be what we call compounded or complex grief. So we have one grief cycle happening for a specific loss. The loss of being able to go to eat in a restaurant, for example. I'll take something minor. To going to now I've lost someone I love on top of that, to now I lost my job because the business shut down or they're bankrupt. Now it just stacks on. And each loss starts its own cycle. It's not like they get married. They're happening simultaneously, which is why it makes a compound or complex. So in this loss and grief cycle, phase one is that shock and denial. I'm shocked that it happened, or I'm denying that it happened. There's no real time frame for this because everyone's different. There are people who have lost important things that have stayed in shock and denial for years. I'm not saying that would happen now, but that is how that works. There's no time frame, no expectation. When we move into the grief cycle, and we're going to start to see some animation here, so it's going to spin around and things. The second phase is where we're managing through anger, depression, and bargaining. So anger is that anger at myself or others. If we put it in a loss of a person. This is when I get angry at the person for not doing what they were supposed to do, or I get angry at myself for not doing what I could have done, get angry at the world, get angry at a higher power if that's your belief. We're getting angry, and that's part of healing, because if we hold on to that anger, it's going to fester and essentially get quote unquote infected in our emotions. Depression is feeling the loss. What we had is gone. So that can lead to obviously depression, but despair, isolation. Sometimes it could be a haze or a fog that we're in. We just can't get out of it. We can't grasp, because in our brain, that limbic system and attachment for the loss. So remember, attachment goes with loss. If we lose something important to us, we lost an attachment, which is in that part of the brain. So it's really related to survival grief. Then there's bargaining. Bargaining is, so anger's an emotion, depression's an emotion. The emotion that goes with bargaining is that anxiety that we feel. That's that what if or if only. That's us trying to figure out how we can resolve the future fear of not having what we had or have. So what happens in the grief process is, let me go back, I'm sorry. What happens in the grief process is it cycles. So for whatever reason, I apologize, the animation isn't working. So it cycles. So it starts spinning and spinning. So it starts out fast, and then the more time goes on, it gets larger and larger and can't spin as fast. So it's slowing down and slowing down and slowing down. And eventually what happens when it slows down enough, in fact, I think it's going to spin here. There it goes. There we go. So this is what's happening inside of us. It's changing. It's moving. It's flipping. It's showing us and helping us work through each piece of this in our loss to think about what's to come. As it gets longer in time, it slows down and it starts moving differently. We get more attention to different ones. They may last for a short amount of time and we have more space between the next one, if you will. So at the beginning, they're tight and close. The further out we get, the more separated they get, the more gaps in the quote unquote grief experience do we have. Once we get through that and are able to process through that, what happens is that circle sort of opens up and flatlines. Once it flatlines, then we're ready to move to the final phase of grief, which is our acceptance phase. And this is where we reset. This is where we have the new normal. This is where we've accepted the new normal. That's what acceptance really means in this cycle. It's not that I've accepted that the loss has happened. In many situations, that feeling of loss or that piece of grief stays with us forever. It won't go away. But what we get to a point is accepting that I can live life effectively without whatever I lost. Okay. This is going to take time until after COVID. We're not going to be able to be at this phase right now. We're in all that spinning and cycling. And that's really what we need to be mindful of. We're all spinning and cycling. And that's important. That's important when we are in those moments when we have clarity, to be mindful of that. So when we're around someone who may not have that clarity or may be experiencing something, we can then respond to them in a way that they could receive. Often in grief, people can get frustrated with others and kind of tell them what to do. We all know that's not helpful when we've grieved in our lives. What all people need when they're grieving is comforting and soothing. Um, Again, going back to the brain pieces, so this limbic system is kind of where grief lives somewhat, which means the left brain's not really involved. The right brain is. So the right brain has a direct connection to that limbic system. So the right brain's feeling, if we can get that left brain involved, we can help at least mitigate and manage, going back to the whole point of the presentation today. This is how we can manage that grief while we're going through it. The other, and probably the most important component when we're grieving, is giving ourselves permission to feel the pain. That's the biggest challenge, is we have to be able to tell each other and ourselves, it's okay to feel the pain. We have to do it responsibly and safely, and if we're those people who feel pain better with others, then feel pain together. Again, every human on this earth is going through grief on some level, some more than others, but everyone has a grief cycle going on because we've all lost something. So this is just kind of a pictorial of our experience in compounded grief with the pandemic. So we've lost safety. We've all lost some safety, We also have lost people, maybe not physically, but proximity-wise. Freedom. We've lost some of our freedom that we as Americans are accustomed to. There's our physical proximity we've lost, We've also lost the benefit of routine. So routine helps the left brain stay online. And now we have all these going at the same time. All these grief cycles going at the same time. That's what we're experiencing, Think just that. Let me see if I can get that to do. I'm going to do that again because that's an important thing to see, because that's what's happening inside of us. This is what's happening every day inside of us. No wonder we're all emotional in some way, shape, or form. We are reacting normally to abnormal circumstances. We got to remember that. So I'm going to pause here for some questions again. So let me stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I think a lot of the conversation that's more common is talking about stress. And I feel as if, people will, okay, I'm going to be less stressed. So therefore, I'm going to go do whatever I need to do to be less stressed. But we're not having that grief conversation. We're not even having it.
No.
At all. So I love this because we're going to start having it.
We have to. Right. We have to.
Yeah.
We have to.
Absolutely. And recognizing that everybody's going through it, no matter if, because I hear from so many people, and I know I've said it too, I'm fine because my world hasn't changed that much because, I work at home anyway. And so I didn't have to shift that much. But when I look at my teens and they're not doing their senior year or their college experience, they have it much worse. So therefore I'm going to make sure that I'm there for them. I did that for the first month or 2 months. And then I realized, you know what? No. You know what? I'm going to just say it blew for me. I was like, no, this blew for me, right?
Right.
I'm going to accept that. The minute I did it, all of a sudden it was like this big weight lifted off my shoulders. And I said, okay, it doesn't make it any better, but now at least I'm being honest.
Right.
And that was the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I feel that people will feel guilty if they're not a first responder, or if they haven't lost anybody directly, or if they don't have food insecurity added onto this, or housing insecurity, or any economic issues,
Right.
or whatever, right? Or their life hasn't been as impacted as someone else's.
Right.
I think we have to give ourselves permission. I loved when you said that. Give ourselves permission to feel whatever it is we're feeling, because everybody's lost something.
Exactly. And that permission is key. Permission to feel it and permission to be honest about it.
Right.
That's the other important part, because, those of us who are those, caretakers or in the field, we're gonna say it's fine because we have to in some situations. But if we don't give ourselves the balance on the other side, where we have those moments where we can be honest with ourselves or those we care about, then we create a greater imbalance in ourselves, because we get into that mindset without relief.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And
Well, that's the thing. There really is no relief, right?
yeah,
When we look at those stages of grief, and the first stage is there's no timeline. So we could all be there now, right? Like to varying degrees, right?
right,
And stay there for X amount of time.
right.
Then that 12 to 24 months kicks in. So my brain goes to, okay, so whenever the pandemic reaches its arc, like we haven't reached the apex yet, right? So post apex, whatever that curve looks like, I would almost say to myself, hit the timer then.
Yep.
So we're looking at 2 years after the apex arcs, and we start getting smooth to be able to get to the point where there will be, from a global perspective or like a macro perspective,
Mhm.
the new normal.
Right, right. Yeah, 12 to 24 months for each individual cycle.
Right.
That's another important
Oh,
piece.
for each individual cycle. Okay.
Yeah.
So is that
So
times 3, or is that
it depends on when it started for the person, you know?
okay?
Everyone
Oh, right. For
experiences
each individual grief cycle. Yes. Okay.
right,
Yes, I
right,
agree
right,
with
right,
you.
right.
Yes.
So, so yeah, once that apex hits, once the arc's on the curve, there'll be a first wave of people who start to feel that grief and start to really process more
Yep.
to get through it. And those who have sort of that access to internal skill sets, just because that's how they were able to live their life, that's great. You know, will come to a resolution more quickly. You know,
Right.
and that 12 to 24 months is it's a guide, but not a
Right.
rule.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
There are some people who experience the grief cycle for a very, very long time. There are some people who kind of get through it in 6 months. Um, this idea that grief is over in like a month or so is just not accurate to the human experience. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it just takes more time than that for us to get comfortable with the new normal, you know?
Right. Right.
So, but yeah, you're right. That clock will start when we start feeling that it's over, if you
Right.
will.
Right. And I'm just saying from a macro perspective, oh, I
Right.
appreciate
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
whenever we reach that curve, that I'm in my mind, I'm saying, okay, add 24 months. That's
Exactly.
what that's
Yep.
what
Yep.
just said to
Yep.
me,
Yep.
okay, add 24 months for that, to say,
Yep.
okay, now we've got critical mass, if you will, of what a new normal definition could look like.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
So
Right.
another question I have is based on past, right? So I don't know that we have any data from the Spanish flu, because I don't know that anybody ever talked about feelings back then, right?
Right.
So there's that, but we can look, can we, I guess this is the question, can we look at similar circumstances like the Depression or World War II or Vietnam or something, where there was this massive threat to humanity, maybe not global, but certainly significant? Do we know what that, do we have any sort of information that we could, to increase our understanding, increase our awareness, get our left
So this,
operating?
yeah. So you know, when it comes to that, I mean, yeah, there is some information out there, but context is important. When
Okay.
we look at every other pandemic, I mean, the most recent one was 100 years ago,
Right.
similar to this. I mean, there there wasn't the technology that exists now. I
Right.
mean, people didn't have access to information
True.
like we do now. So to find out it was going on, it took a long time for people just to find out it was going on, you know? And think about all the people who didn't read the newspapers, you know? They didn't know what was going on until someone told them.
Right.
So information traveling also changes it, both in a good way and a bad way. So
Yeah.
that was protective at that point. At the same time, at that time in the world, they couldn't be as reactive or responsive
Right.
because
Right.
it wasn't as clear. Where we're able to be much more active and in some cases proactive because we have access to information. But depression is consistent, and that is because in every pandemic you will see a shift in that the feelings of depression because of the grief cycle kicking in.
Right.
You know, it's always gonna feel that down, that depressed, that isolation, that fog. Those are very common human experiences, that when we're all collectively feeling grief, that it also we're naturally empathetic beings too. So when we feel someone else's pain, we're going to take a piece of that. We're going to feel that. And if we're around everybody who's feeling down, for example, we're going to feel more down in whatever
Right.
is natural for us. And so that's a key piece. Is there's a level of that happening now with depression specifically, which is also feeding into, like I said earlier, the spike in addiction, and
Right.
and
Right.
really the opioid struggle is huge right now.
Yeah. Like it wasn't before. Like, so
Right,
this,
like it was right,
right?
exactly. Just made it worse. Yeah.
Wow.
So there is some ways we could look at it in terms of historically, but like you said, things were very different 100 years ago. I'm just using that as a
Yeah.
benchmark. Not that there weren't other things earlier, but that was the most comparable, I would say, was about 100 years ago. You
Okay.
know, that's 1920. I mean, think about the 20s. I mean,
Yeah.
right before the Depression hit. So that's
Right.
the other challenge is, there was a lot of other things happening at that time,
Right.
both in positive ways and negative ways. So contextually, yes, I think that's the consistency is there's that depression, that loss, that grief piece that's coming. And depression is the most, generally speaking, socially acceptable emotion when it comes to loss or
Okay.
grief.
Yep.
Everyone would understand that. People don't understand when people get angry when they're grieving. That's
Right.
confusing to a lot of people. Anxious is less confusing, but
Right. Yeah. I was going to say anxiety, people would
yeah,
understand.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So those that's why we would see more depression and or anxiety in our today's society because of the access to information that, depending on a person's natural temperament, could increase anxiety naturally. Just having too much information, not
Right.
knowing what to follow, that's where it could also increase anxiety.
Well, I just think, I mean, this is fascinating when you look at the grief model, because I always associated like three sides of one coin, which that is not possible, but that in my head I did. And it was anger, anxiety, and depression. So when you just said that, a light bulb went off in my head and I said, oh, that's grief. I never thought of it that
Right, right. Yeah, that's great.
way. Yeah. So there's my left brain going, yay, I'm having a
Yeah,
little
right.
fun over here.
But see that, right, that in and of itself, that's important. See that piece, that getting that left brain online around this information is protective,
Right.
because now we have a why. We can say why.
Right.
We're comforted in understanding the reason as humans. If we know why something's happened, even if it's bad, we can understand it. We may be outraged, we might have other emotions, but at least we can understand it then. And
Right.
that's really the heart at what I'm hoping comes out of this, is that we understand why we're feeling what we're feeling, why we're doing what we're doing. So
Mhm.
then we don't worry as much about it happening, but focus more on how can we heal and feel better.
Right. Exactly. Making that choice.
Right.
Right.
Right. Mhm.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Therese, did you have a question? Okay, great. Let me share my screen. Okay, so our last objective, practicing, putting it together. Okay, so perception and experience is what we're working with here. So our perceptions, like we've talked about, come from how we process information. Grief becomes an overlay on that. That influences some perception. Then as we experience our life, those perceptions are either supported or denied. They get stronger or weaker, essentially, based on our experiences. So, we have what's going on now is we have organized memories happening, we have disorganized memories happening, we have typical grief happening, and we have global grief happening. Okay. So going back to that global grief, just to make a comment about that, global grief incites that survival mechanism in a species way, going back to that process and procreation. So that's why global grief's here, because that's impacting everybody. That helps with community and also can distract from community, depending on how we are conceptualizing it in our areas or regions. And as I mentioned here, the behaviors that come out of that are that fight, flight, or freeze when we're facing threat, which, as we mentioned, in today's world, we're facing threat on any moment in any given day. So these could be moving in and out depending on how much tolerance we have to them. And then once we have that information, that fuel and process system kicks in, where we're either soothing by ingesting or soothing by doing something that's routine or repetitive or that helps us burn the energy, essentially. Um, so that's kind of where we're landing now with all the information that we have. So what do we want to do with this? We want to work on getting our thinking more online in these moments of potential stress. Okay, so I have a couple lists here. On the left here is a little more of a comprehensive list of what the left brain manages. Um, Analytical thought, orientation, um, order and sequence, rational thought, verbal language, being cautious, planning, math and science, our logic. These last two are really important. Our left brain is responsible for our right side of our body. And you'll see when we talk about the right brain, it's also similar. The reason that's important is if you want to activate your left brain quickly, do something with the right side of your body. It'll activate your left brain. That's a beautiful thing. We'll talk about that when we get to what we can do. So what can we do to activate the left brain? We need to do things that have order related to them. That is something that's easy to do. So one of the examples I think about when I think about order and language is Scrabble. Playing Scrabble brings on the left brain. Most games will bring on the left brain. That will help your left brain. There may be some games I'm not aware of that wouldn't, but when you're trying to use language or expression to drive something and communicate it, it's the communicating part that the left brain does. The right brain creates it, but the left brain communicates it. So also using things so symbolic language is simply the words that we're using and the numbers that we use. So if you speak English, your symbolic language is different than someone who may speak Spanish, for example. Still the same still language, still speaking, still communicating, but the symbols are different, essentially. Putting things in order. Now this those who love to organize will love to hear this. Putting things in order. Going through your closet and organizing something will activate the left brain in a very different way, because you have to analyze, you have to assess, and then you synthesize things back together. So that's an important piece. Like I said, numbers. So if you're not a math person but you like games, that Sudoku is a game that can really help because it's numbers and it's order. But anything we can do with numbers will help the left brain move. Puzzles. Puzzles are a really great thing because it actually activates both the right and left, but the left has to analyze, so it has to do a little more work. And then training your brain, meaning when we are starting to feel stress, do things in those moments to activate the left brain. So something that I have done at times is, I got to put a disclaimer here. So it's important that anything you do does not interfere with your ability to live a functional life. So if you have to do something like this instead of eating, that's a problem. If you are doing something like this instead of caring for your child, that's a problem. So that's an important piece. So there's a limit to how much is helpful. Okay, but counting your steps when you're walking outside can help at least your left brain online. Because if you're out in public, or counting something, again, there's a point where that can become compulsive and problematic. But counting things in general can help that left brain stay online, for example. And then journaling. So journaling can have a cliche because it's often recommended for many, many different things. But the truth is, journaling ignites both your left and right brain, but your left brain actually has to formulate what you're putting on the paper. Okay. Now, in journaling, I personally recommend what I would call old-fashioned journaling with a pen and paper versus typing, because typing is a different thing. Some of the waves that come from screens change our brains differently. So when we're typing, there's a little bit of a disconnect that can happen. But if we're writing on paper, it's really forcing the whole brain to work at that point, and that is a way, going back to something you asked Kim earlier about that memory that I might not remember if I had a health issue. Journaling can help bring that out as well. Again, putting a caution on there, if you're a person who has a history of known trauma, that's not something I would do without support of someone knowing you're doing it, because implicit memory can become explicit memory, and that could be a trauma we don't remember and we don't know what that is. So we need to be responsible when we're doing that. But journaling about your day, you know, or your week or your future plans, that's another very important piece. Remember past and future. So the left brain, the work we want to do if we're doing something in terms of thinking, instead of thinking about the past, think about the future. It does two things. It helps activate the left brain, and it incites and promotes hope. And hope is what we all need right now. We know this is going to end at some point. We know we'll get through it, for the most part, because we have history to show us that we're able to get through these things. It's not easy. It's difficult, of course, but having that hope is a left brain concept because we're thinking about the future. Then that translates to the right to have that feeling of hope. So those are some things that we can do individually. What's also important is sharing this forward, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But anything that works for you or any concept you're taking away from today, share it. That's one of the best things we can do. So how do we manage our feelings? Like I said, that's that right-left brain communication that we need to activate, because the feelings are between the right brain and the limbic system, but it's not pulling into the left brain when we're not actively trying to pull it into the left brain. So what we want to do is try to get the right and left to communicate here. So the right brain is always online. The right brain's not turning off. It's the left brain that we got to keep online. The way to keep it online is to feed the left brain from the right brain information. So a way to do that, and there's a few examples here, is coloring in the lines. So the lines help the left brain stay activated. So if we think about young children who can't color in the lines or don't color in the lines, it's because they're neurologically incapable of it, because their left brain isn't developed enough yet to do that. So that's an example. But the coloring is important because the coloring activates that right brain, and it keeps it awake, and it's something that the left brain can relate to. Okay, but it's a right brain creative activity, and creative activities help soothe. Okay, so getting the left brain is going to help us be analytical and help manage some of the emotions. But going back to that permission to feel the emotions, the right brain is how we feel the emotions explicitly. So coloring in the lines is an example, but the coloring books, anything that you can do that has color related to it helps stimulate the brain. Even if you're colorblind, that you still see other colors. So use the colors that work for you. If you have, visual impairments, you can still imagine what it might, other senses sound like, smell like, taste like. One of the pieces that we'll talk about in a moment is really isolating some sensory experiences, because that feeds right in mostly to the right brain. The sense of smell, remember, goes to the limbic system. So just an example, if someone's really overwhelmed on a regular basis, um, something that they can use to help just manage that is find a smell that really helps calm or soothe them, because it gets in there faster, and carry it with them. Put it on a napkin or a handkerchief or something, and keep it with you. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, you can smell that. I know it's something simple, but it's something that gets in there faster and can help soothe faster. Here again, permission to feel. And so when I say feel, we're going to feel no matter what, but bringing it forward and expressing it forward. So getting it out in journaling. Here again, journaling also helps that right and left brain communication. If we look at all the activities here on that right brain list, there's intuitive thought. So instinct is in that right brain. Holistic perception. So the way we view situations. So from that macro level, that's the right brain component. Random sequencing. So this is, if you think about, so when I think about random sequencing, I think about a game that was in arcades, or at some point, I think it was in Chuck E. Cheese, if anyone knows that reference. There was this whack-a-mole where moles would jump up and you'd hit it with a thing. That's random sequencing. That was right brain training, okay? Because you're trying to predict and react in a situation in a fun way. So that's an example of that, what random sequencing looks like in life. Um, Emotional thought. So when we're pondering our grief and the emotions that are coming out, if we're not getting it out, expressing it, or not hearing it in our mind's ear, then it's being stopped. It's not getting to that left brain. So getting it out. So you have the thought, but getting it out of the thought into something. This is where creative activities come in: sculpting, drawing, painting. Even if you're not good at it, I'm not good at those things, but I do it anyways because it helps. Um, you know, looking at pictures, taking pictures, looking at scenery, those types of things. So as I mentioned a moment ago, watching something on a screen is fine, but there are waves that come out of monitors and screens that affect the way we process information in the brain. That's outside the scope of today, but that's an important piece to remind ourselves. And in today's world, we're on screens all day. Almost everybody, depending on your life experience or circumstance. So taking time to not be at a screen and doing something is important. Nonverbal, our body language is managed by the right brain. Being adventurous, being impulsive, creative writing and art, like I mentioned, imagination. So you can, if you are able to imagine an experience, that will activate your right brain. And as you're going through and building the details start to come from the left brain. So that's how they can work together as well. And these last two, as I said, left vision and left motor skills. So the left side of our body is managed by the right side of our brain. These are important when we go to the next slide. The next slide is, what can we do? What are the actions we can do? So first bullet point, bilateral stimulation. So that's a fancy term for going left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. The reason that's important is because that is how we keep the brain online. We are naturally bilateral beings. We can't move without assistance, without going left, right, or right, left, whichever way you want to start. That provokes the energy to be shared back and forth. So that's why walking and exercising when we're doing left, right is so relaxing once you can get to that point. Starting out can be difficult and frustrating and irritating and all those other things. But once we can get into some level of a routine, that helps promote that bilateral stimulation. So an activity that you can do that's real simple is rocking side to side at home. Left, right, left, right. Tap your legs left, right, slowly. You don't want to do it fast. If you do it too fast, it can activate too much emotion. So, but for soothing, if you just rock left to right, or tap your knees or tap your feet left to right slowly, and think about something pleasant, that in and of itself can help soothe as well. Breathing. So breathing helps us get a direct touch to our nervous system. So breathing in 8-second intervals. So, that's what is considered ideal in research, but everyone has a unique way that goes. Some people may inhale for 4 and exhale for 4. Some people may need to inhale for 6 and exhale for 3. So again, it's a guide, not a rule. But finding the interval that works best for you to soothe your system is key. So deep breathing or breathing will work for everybody. The question is how, or what's the organization of that breathing? Figuring that out just independently by yourself also activates your left brain because you're analyzing what you're doing, and then finally, sensory grounding. So this is where you focus on a single sense in a given moment. And this is really what you want to do when you're feeling very overwhelmed or emotional is, focus on a lamp, or I don't know, a point in the room, or a smell, or close your eyes and just listen, hear the sounds. Limiting to one sense and really trying to hone in on that sense will ground you into the present because that's activating the right brain explicitly. Then analyzing what's coming in to figure out what it might be or how it feels is the left brain. But we're activating our entire map system in our spinal cord because that sensory information forces us to feel something in a different way. Finally, how do we engage each other in doing all these things? So this is all great for us to do individually. But one of the most important things, and we've said this a couple times today, is to talk about what we're experiencing with each other that we trust. Okay, so that's an important thing. You have to trust who you're talking to. You have to feel comfortable sharing what you're going to share, but talk about the experiences. That when we don't give voice to something, there's two things that can happen. One, we can create stories about it in our head that may not be accurate. And two, it doesn't make it real. That's a big part of the reason why we as humans don't talk about some things. Because if we say it, it's real. If it's in our head, it's a thought. None of us really consciously do that, but we just do that naturally to protect ourselves. Talking about it makes it real. It also opens up that permission. It takes a lot of bravery and courage to start talking about what you're experiencing. So we can't negate that. It takes a lot, a lot. But once you start opening that up slowly, I don't encourage anyone to just start, vomiting all their experiences out right now. But slowly building that experience where you can share what you're going through, and remembering, and something you said, Kim, I think is really important earlier, really remembering that my experience may not be as bad as someone else, but it's also going to be worse than someone else. No matter what our experience is, there's always someone who has it worse and always someone who has it better. So that's what makes our experience equal to everybody. It's our experience. It impacts us almost equally as anyone else's experience.
Yeah, I love that. I really love that because it's true. I think this helps with permission
Yes.
and
Yeah.
validation, because I'm reading obviously as we're
Yeah.
talking, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's where the next point, the validation. So when we're talking about our experiences, unless someone's asking for advice or recommendations, it's better to just validate the experience. And the easiest way to validate experience is making sure that they understand that you understand and they make sense. So I put a little stem there that could be used. Your experience makes sense because, or you make complete sense is all you could say, and explain why they make sense. So that's another important piece to validation, is not just saying it makes sense, but explaining why it makes sense to you.
Right. Right. You could
That's
even say, I get that. I get that.
right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Then the other piece is group activity. So because we have proximity barriers, um, if you're able to do something with physical distancing, great. If not, do it virtually. But group activities, promoting bilateral stimulation and mantras. So this is where that left brain and that right brain can work together. When we say things over and over and over to ourselves, it creates a new memory network. And the more we say it starts to ingrain that memory network. So we have that to access. So just like we can have negative or disorganized memory networks, we can have positive or protective memory networks. And many people call those resources. Emotional resources, mental resources. I put some examples here that would be helpful given all of our experiences with COVID. I am strong, or we are strong if you're doing it in a group. I'll tell you, if you get a group of people together who just say some of these things as a we collectively at the same time, you will feel that experience, even if it's virtual. You're hearing everyone say that, you're saying it collectively. There is something that builds a attachment in the limbic system when we say the same thing in unison. So strong, brave, we can get through this. That's a really important hope, future, left brain thing to do as a group. We've survived much worse. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves of the past. If you're here today, you have likely survived much worse in the world. Again, that goes in that range. Everyone has it worse. There's always people have it worse, always people that have it better, but it doesn't negate your experience. Then for the individual, I am valuable and I am safe. That's important to remind ourselves, because has the world changed? Absolutely. Has the access to violence changed? Depending on your location, yeah, it's increased in some areas, and in some areas it hasn't. Some areas it's decreased. So this is where geography plays a role, region plays a role, but be mindful of where you are safe. So if you're safe at home, you're safe at home, but you are safe. So that context will help that left brain as well. And then the last one, my feelings are valid. So many, going back to that comment you made earlier, Kim, of the I don't want to say anything because I'm the only one. My feelings are valid. That might be the first step to open that permission. To just say that to yourself, to a person's self over and over. My feelings are valid, you know. Um, so that's what we can do in terms of group activities. I mean, even if you can't physically be together, if you all could take a walk together on Zoom or FaceTime or what have you, you're still doing bilateral stimulation in a group, you know. Um, Finding ways to build activities that can be done virtually, um, like games. So essentially, you could play Scrabble together. You just have to communicate differently. As an example, you know, you could play a game together if you have the same game. You know, you just have to be a little different. You have to be creative with it. If you're able to have to distance physically and do something in person, that's also helpful. You know, if you have access to a park, getting together and doing something to promote bilateral stimulation together is helpful. The collective also helps strengthen the brain as well, because it pulls those who may not have as strong of a left brain as others. So it helps us build together and unite and work off of each other in a way that can support those who may need more support, and provide the support from those who have maybe more than we need in the moment. Um, so with that, that takes us to the end here. So I want to thank you for having me and going through this information. I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for any remaining questions.
This was fabulous. Seriously,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much. This was my left brain and my right brain, they're all going. It's awesome.
That's great. I love to hear that. That's wonderful.
Yeah, this is so helpful. I think people will find this to be incredibly informative, and it was explained at a level and at a pace that was digestible. So thank you for that.
Good. I'm
Truly.
glad to hear that. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. That's really important to me personally, because what's the point of giving information if it can't be used?
Right. Right.
Thank you for the concrete suggestions for
Oh,
your own personal well-being, but to still engage community. I mean, I'm imagining taking a walk with people, even though we're not together. I could have my thing in and be talking to whomever.
right.
So,
Just like that person was next to you.
out in the fresh air, right, left, right, left.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.
You are very, very welcome. I'm glad it was helpful. I'm glad it was valuable, and I'm glad it's usable. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I asked all my questions throughout, so I don't
Great.
have any more questions.
Great.
And I don't think there was anything we didn't ask. I don't, as I'm kind of thinking over the subject matter, I think we talked about everything
Okay.
I
Yeah.
can think of right now.
Wrapped
Great.
it up nicely at the end here. But
Good.
thank you. I mean, it's really, I mean, we play games, but now I can be more conscious of how it's really helping.
Right. 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 Exactly. That's wonderful. Good.
Absolutely.
Good.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gray Brooks. I'm
Absolutely.
so delighted that we were introduced by a family member, and I hope that our paths will cross in the future.
I hope so too. Thank
Very
you all both very much. And for all those watching, thank you for sitting and watching the information. I hope it helps.
Absolutely. So I'm going to stop recording now.